was listening to what you were saying about the curriculum. But it was really around the presence of and what we consider our ideologies around what safety looks like, and how school resource officers are being used within the schools, that we can make sure that we are creating safe spaces for the young people who might be victims.
I mean, the reality about like policing in general in this country, right? And this is not just about school resource officers, but it's that we're at this place where, you know, we're having a reckoning about like what policing was, what the roots of policing were, and those oppressive roots, and how those are continuing to show up, particularly in communities of color, right? And the larger discussion about the war on drugs and how that war on drugs was launched in communities of color when white communities actually are showing up in the research to use drugs at larger and sell drugs at greater rates than people of color, right? And so we're having a conversation about policing and what 21st century policing really needs to look like and what communities of color need. And that's people that have more social work skills, right? I mean, 75% of the calls for service that I went to as a police officer really needed either a social worker or a police officer that had social work skills. And that's just not how law enforcement is being trained. 75% of the training in law enforcement is focused on you know, shooting and driving and taking people down and arresting people and understanding the law, and that it's not a match for like what the actual needs of the community are and what the actual job is. And so I think just kind of applying that larger frame to school resource officers, I would say, number one, in my personal opinion, I don't think those are the right people to be there. I think that we should be putting our effort and our money and our resources into having more social workers and counselors and therapists, et cetera, on campus. But again, going back to my earlier point, that if that's the model that you have and you're unable to undo that model right this moment, then there has to be an understanding about what the officers' roles are, and that has to be very specifically mapped out, and then the officers need specific training. But really, unless it has to do with like physical safety and safety of the school campus, because that's why our excuse as a nation for putting school resource officers into schools was really in response to school shootings, right? And then number one, they're not really being utilized in the areas that mass school shootings have most often historically taken place, which is suburban, mainly white areas. They're being flooded into urban environments. And then we're not utilizing them for like school security measures. We're utilizing them for school discipline. And so I would just say they need to really stay in their lane. I mean, like if we're saying that we need school resource officers on campus, then they should be there for the physical safety and security of the school and the students. They don't really have a place in school discipline or interacting with students in the ways that they are currently.
And can I add, we are, like Holly said, there may be some schools where they have that model and they have to keep that model. Then we need to recognize that, like any other professional, a police officer is not God. A police officer is not guaranteed to be good just because they're a police officer. And like any other person, we would be cautious around the children and making sure it's the right person to be around the children, making sure of that with not only school resource officers, but also school security guards. Because you know what? The security guard at my school, he was a pretty nice guy. And I probably would have told him that the cop was trafficking me, except for he was in a relationship with the senior. So given that, even though he was nice and he never had been inappropriate to me, I knew he was inappropriate because he was in a relationship with the senior. So I didn't tell him about the police officer. So both the police officer and the security guard at my school should have been someone the administrator should have seen and recognized as being inappropriate, because a lot of the behavior was really overt, but it wasn't recognized and kids were getting victimized, you know, myself being one of them, but not only me. And so I think if those folks are going to be in the school, not giving them absolute power, just because you're afraid when a cop stops you to get a ticket doesn't mean you don't protect kids at the school and keep them safe, even if it's from the police. And this is not to say all police are trying to hurt kids, but if there are ones that are trying to do it, are we just going to, put our hands up because they're the cops? Or are we going to have the same scrutiny over them as we would over any adult, especially an adult who's not in the school maybe as regularly as the other teachers that we know better. And are we going to try to build a relationship with this cop like we do with our other colleagues so that we feel comfortable with them and their relationship and interactions with the student? So I think those are all things to think about, because I think in my situation, no one looked at the cop. He had absolute power, and they never would have even known it was the cop. I wrote the dean a letter thinking that she was my friend, which she actually was, telling her about it, being like, officer so-and-so, well, he's actually my boyfriend. So I had to tell him. That's the only way they ever found out, or they never would have found out my whole high school career. So looking at everyone around the kid, including the law enforcement folks, and scrutinizing them.
And I can definitely echo a lot of what Nola's naming, seeing it as a student and even as an administrator, and at times feeling intimidated as a school administrator by the school resource officer on my own campus. And they just have a nuance of how they're able to exert that intimidation. I'm not trying to excuse it. I'm sure it was linked to some of my own stuff around police and safety. And at the same time, there's really, there's not the same teamness that I think needs to be there around school resource officers in school, coming from a place of we're serving kids and keeping a place safe. They're bringing in very much a highway patrol mentality a lot of times into a school setting. There's no reason that school resource officers need to walk your campus daily with guns and expect students to want to go to them, feel safe around them. I often would ask my school resource officer to take off his belt, and it became an ongoing battle. I asked my school resource officer to stop parking his car in front of my high school, because it lends itself to the community seeing, oh, that's that school. They always have the police there. Well, he works there. He has an office there. But when he's the only car parked in front of my entire school and everyone else is parked in the parking lot, it makes it look like he's quote unquote above the law, and that we need this police presence at our school, which is the school for kids of color in the district. And so it just really lends itself to some other types of conversations that need to happen. The good old boys network vibe between police officers and the campus security. Definitely the familiarity of campus security with girls. I just think across the board, if you're a campus supervisor and you're over 30-something years old, you should not be at a high school campus as a man, because I've seen too much of the flirtatiousness happening with the 18-year-old girls, the 17-year-old girls, and this campus supervisor just graduated from the same school 2 years ago. So he's feeling a sense of camaraderie that should not be there, nor is it age appropriate in a lot of ways. And so I just appreciate you pointing that out, Nola, and it's a very real issue as well as we work on this sexualization of our girls and the types of roles that some of the men play on campus that don't work hand in hand.